about judgment, judging. By what merit we judge others, we ourselves will be judged, so we better be very careful about what we speak out and how we look at other people. This week, we're going to address giving. When you start reaching into people's pocketbooks, their money, their monetary things, it can be a touchy situation or a touchy request. But God says we're to give. We're to help out others, brothers and sisters in need, and the church. We're to finish what we start, which is part of what Paul is addressing in his letter to Corinth. So I'm going to ask David, will you open us up in prayer, please?
Father, Lord Jesus, thank you again, Lord, for letting us come to your house, Lord Father, rising us in the right mind, Lord Father.
Thank you, Lord.
And just watching over us, we slept last night, Lord Father. I ask you to be in all your houses around the world today, Lord Father. Be with all the teachers, Lord, as they bring the word, Lord Father. Give them the words of clarity and mind, Lord Father, and let us receive, Lord, what you've given them, Lord Father. Have your way in this house right here, Lord. And it's in Jesus' name we ask, Lord. Amen.
Amen. All right, our text this week comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And actually, it told us to read chapter 8, verse 1, going through chapter 9, verse 15, so all the way through that. But for time's sake, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Our introduction says, giving is hard to do. Some give in order to receive gratitude and praise from those to whom they give. What did he tell? Don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. Give in secret. Don't give before man to receive praise and honor from him. But we do know in our society that is, and even in the church, that is something that people do. They want to be recognized for what they give and for what they do. And God says, man, applaud you, you're openly rewarded. But you do it in secret and not let everyone know all those things that you do, that he, your Father, will reward you. So I think that we should pin roses on people, as we've talked about in here before. You've heard the preacher say, you've heard many others say, pin a rose on them while they're alive. Thank them. Recognize them for the good that they do. Because sometimes it is that simple pat on the back that encourages and keeps them going forward, just to know that it's appreciated. But that comes from someone else. It doesn't come from them waving their hand saying, look at me, look at me. It is when someone comes forth and recognizes someone else for what they're doing or what they've done. And I believe God puts that on people's hearts. A lot of times I do. If we're obedient to the Spirit and we're listening to the Spirit, we will receive that guidance. And I think sometimes he lays it on our hearts to give recognition to those people. But there are some who do it. It is out of 2 Corinthians. No, August 12th. I did Romans last week. Yeah, that's okay. No, so, yeah. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Mm-hmm. Don't scare me like that, Jerry, because I'm like, because it's been a distractful week, I'm going to tell you. So I'm like, oh, Lord.
I told sis I didn't read the lesson this week, and I'm like, where's that?
That's okay.
I'm in Romans again.
Nope, go to Corinthians.
Carry
So, catch up. Some give to be recognized as being generous and thoughtful people. If there is some reward one is seeking, is it really giving? Or is it buying something? I thought that was a great question. If you seek to be recognized by giving, are you actually giving or are you buying something? True giving from the heart does not even remember giving. In 2 Corinthians 8, verses 7 through 15, like I said, I'm not going to read all of the scripture that was given us in our lesson text. Paul says, therefore, as ye abound in everything in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all diligence and in your love to us, see that ye abound in this grace also. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. For ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient for you, who have begun before, not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now therefore perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, so there may be a performance also out of that which ye have. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. For I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. Verse 15 comes from back in Exodus when the manna would come from heaven, and God told them every day you had to go out and gather except for Sunday. And on Saturday, or the day before the Sabbath, you would gather double the portion so that you did not have to go out on the Sabbath and gather. Those who gathered a whole lot still had nothing left over, and those who may have gathered too little did not lack in anything. So he took care, and that spoke a lot to me. We'll talk more about that scripture a little bit later. So we want to break down our scripture. In studying the text, it says, what is the most important part of worship? We could all give different answers. Do people even think of putting money in the offering plate as an act of worship? Unlike other things associated with worship, we cannot be passive in giving. It requires active participation, even sacrifice. While there are certainly similarities between Paul's various letters, there are also striking differences. Each epistle was written to a particular group of individual with unique needs and concerns. This is giving you a little bit of the forefront of this. This is clearly seen when comparing the two letters penned to the church at Corinth. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians focused on problems he had been informed of and on questions they had presented to him. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians is quite different, however. The first 7 chapters are mostly a defense of Paul's ministry there. Both detractors from within and enemies from without were calling into question his apostolic ministry. Chapters 10 through 13 focus on false teachers who were attempting to infiltrate the Corinthian church. Sandwiched between these two sections is an exhortation to complete an offering in which they had promised to participate. It provides us with the longest single body of teaching on giving in the New Testament. One way that unity could be enhanced was to encourage Gentile believers to help poor Jewish believers. So as Paul traveled among the Gentiles, he collected funds to help the poverty-stricken saints in Jerusalem. The Corinthians had asked about this effort earlier, and Paul had instructed them on gathering the funds. From what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, it is clear that the church had not followed through on their promise to share in this offering. Using the Macedonian churches as an example, and that comes from verses 1 through 4, he was using them that not only these Macedonians didn't have much to give, they gave over and above what they had. Paul encouraged the Corinthians to do likewise. In spite of their own poverty, the Macedonians had done more than expected. As we know from 1 Corinthians, the believers in Corinth were extremely gifted. They excelled in many ways, in faith, in gifted speakers, in knowledge, and in earnest enthusiasm in serving. Since the Corinthians had excelled in all these things, it was fitting that they abound in this grace also. The grace Paul was speaking of here was the grace of giving. While the word grace is frequently used in the New Testament in relation to salvation, it is also found in other contexts. The Greek word translated grace is charis. This word is related to charisma, referring to a gift of grace and often used of spiritual gifts. How many know that giving is a spiritual gift? Although some may be reluctant to acknowledge it or practice it, God indeed blesses us so that we can bless others. So giving is a gift of one of the gifts of the Spirit. And I'm going to tell you, not everybody has that. I do believe we're all called to give. And just because that might not be our gift, it doesn't mean that we're not to participate in giving and taking care of the needs of others. But there are some that God gives that gift. If we go back and I think about Tabitha or Dorcas that we read, it was the woman that Peter raised from the dead. She was a free giver in the community. They talked about that. She was always going and helping the widows and those that were in need. She had the gift of giving. I know people who have the gift of giving. It is a gift, but just because you don't have that particular gift in your heart doesn't exclude you from helping others that you see in need. We are called to do that.
You can tell it's a gift of God because you don't want to do it. Your nature says, I want to keep what I got instead of giving it away.
Mm-hmm. So when you have that heart that you will... I remember one time Becky and Jason and David and I were newlyweds trying to, make it and struggling a little bit. And I'll never forget that Jason, we didn't know it at the time, and this was before he even actually got back into church and was saved. I say was saved because he got saved later on down the road. Worked a whole extra week. Do you remember that? Worked a whole extra week. And they went and stocked us with groceries so that would be an expense that was taken off of us at that time. That's a heart for giving. Becky was like that. Even when I taught on Dorcas and Tabitha, Becky was one that came to my mind. She would keep things in her home ready to have at her fingertips to give to anyone that might need something. And so she had that gift of giving. But the thing was, too, that it said in verse 7, therefore, as ye abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all diligence and in your love to us, see that ye abound in this grace also. So it tells us that the Corinthians were blessed in the fact that they were extremely gifted in faith, in gifted speakers, in knowledge, and in earnest enthusiasm in serving. Verses 8 through 9 tells us, I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. For ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. Now Paul says, I come not by commandment. Paul started the churches in Corinth, so therefore he really had, I guess, the authority to come forward to them and say, I command to give you. But, if you come forward to someone and command them and demand of them to do specific things, their heart, most of the time, is not going to be in what it is. Even though what they're doing is good, God's looking at the heart and the motive behind what you're doing and why you're doing it. So Paul said, I come to you. I'm not commanding you to do these things. He wanted to test the sincerity of their love. And how did he do this? By comparing their attitude to the eager diligence of others, namely the aforementioned Macedonian saints, because he reminded them or told them how the Macedonians had given, even though they had nothing really to give. They were ones that were struggling, but they saw the eagerness of the Corinthians in the beginning, and it talks about it here, or he's reminding them, you made a commitment, and I need you to follow through with that. They set the example. Their eagerness and their earnestness in giving in the beginning set afire the others. So in the beginning, they were the example for others to give. For some reason, and when we read on, they had fallen through, or they had not followed through, but they had fallen from completing the promise that they had made, and we're not sure what reasons. But so he reminded them of the Macedonians, or told them about the Macedonians and how they had given. But his ultimate example was Jesus Christ. We cannot outgive God.
Why do you think poor people give more than rich
They know what it is to struggle. Because I believe it's because they know what it is to struggle. My daddy grew up dirt poor. We're talking run the rats out of the shack before you can move in. You scan the banks of the river in the morning for duck eggs for breakfast. I mean, he grew up extremely poor.
Depression, was he born into depression? My dad was born on the end of it, right at the start, the end of it. 39, that's at the end, right at the end of it, but it's still, yeah.
Well, and he's a mountain person. You know, I mean, we know that back in the Appalachian Mountains, I mean, people struggle. It's still poor back in there. But I think that, Jerry, to answer your question, why do poor people tend to give more? I think it's because they know what it is to struggle. They know what it is to be in want. They know what it is to watch your children or be the child that grew up not knowing whether or not they were going to have food on the table in the morning. And so, therefore, my daddy has always been a generous man. He worked hard because he wanted his family not to struggle, but he didn't take care of just his family. I learned from my daddy very early on that giving is a joy that you have in your heart. And I think sometimes, though, that when we that we can go through struggles and we're so worried about our own situation, sometimes we lose sight. Sometimes we do lose sight because life can be such a struggle for ourselves and putting food on the table. I mean, it's no secret. You guys know David and I struggled after we moved down here and we lost the business. We struggled. And he had his surgery and his arm didn't work. And it was one thing after another. And so in my own life, this lesson was really a lot, like I said, for me. And we talked about that, you know, our lessons that we teach as teachers. Because I think I had lost sight. Not that I still... not having a willing heart to give and to help others and to do, is that sometimes we're so afraid that if we give then what am I going to do with my family? Which in our lesson it does teach us is that if we have obligations to our children, to older parents that we might be taken of, we're not to take away so that they do without, to give to others. We are obligated and we should take care of those that are under our care. So we shouldn't give beyond what we can give. There are times, however, that I believe God does call us to that because he says, you have to trust me. You have to trust me. I've already got it taken care of. You just have to trust me. But he reminded them that Jesus Christ had it all. He was the Son of God in heaven with all riches. Yet he gave it all up and came to this stinking, rotten world. Corrupt, sinful. And even Jesus, you know, they asked him, you know, where are you staying? He said, you know, the foxes have holes. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He gave up everything, and I do believe that, which we know, we've taught, we know there's reasons why he came the way that he did, because the Jews were looking for a king to come and set them free from Roman Empire rule, and so that's what they were looking for. That's what they would have accepted. If he had come like that, he wouldn't have had to go to the cross, I don't believe. But he came the way he did for more than one reason. I think we can apply it to our lesson today because he came to show us that sometimes we have to give up something to bless or help someone else. Sometimes you might have to give up that Friday night date and movie because you know there's a brother or sister that really needs that $40 or $50. Sometimes you might skimp a little bit at the grocery store because you need to buy something, skimp for yourself, because you know there might be somebody that you need to buy a little extra and take to them. Christ set the example of sacrifice, sacrificial giving. I think we've lost sight of that. I know Valerie has lost sight of that. That he came down here, gave up all perfection in heaven to walk this earth for me. He suffered for me. He is our example of suffering for others. He is our example of giving. And we could go on and say what all examples that he is for us. Here, he teaches me that for me to give up just a little bit of something to bless somebody else, it's not a whole lot. Setting myself up against him, he should be the only one that we compare ourselves to. Said it in last week's lesson. To judge someone, who am I to compare someone else to me or myself to someone else? He is the only one that I should be comparing myself to. So even in my giving, in my helping others, he should be the one that I am looking at as the example of what I sacrifice. He was reminding the Corinthians that for their sakes he became poor. He gave up all the riches and came to earth for us, that we might be rich. Grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. That's what he gave me. That's what he gave me. Verse 10 says, "And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient to you, for you, who have begun before, not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now therefore perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, so there may be a performance also out of that which ye have." So he's going back and reminded them, a year ago, you made a vow to help and give to those that were in need. Since Paul was not going to order the Corinthian church to give, he offered them some advice. The advice would be expedient, that is appropriate, advantageous, better, or best. Paul was simply outlining the best course of action for the Corinthians under the present circumstances. From what Paul said here, we discover that the Corinthians had not completely dropped the ball regarding the offering for the poor. They were eager to participate and had actually given some money or had it readily available when the time came for it to be delivered to Jerusalem. They had demonstrated the willingness or desire to give a year earlier or at some point during the previous year. Perhaps it was simple procrastination that kept them from following through. Hello. Oh, heaven help me. I am probably one of the world's worst procrastinators. And that's actually a sin. Lord help me.
Procrastinators? I didn't know that. I thought it was a manly thing.
No, Jerry. I might be the only woman, but yeah, here I am. Whatever was behind it, they had not come through as promised. Paul's advice, therefore, was simply to finish what they had begun. They should not wait until times got better or until people might, for whatever reason, be more willing to give. It is very important as followers of Jesus Christ that we finish what we start. From the Bible, it tells us that he will finish the good work that he has started in you. He came, he went to the cross, he rose again. Christ finished what he started. There he is as another example for us. He finished everything he started.
That's right. So you ain't got to worry about him giving up on you.
No, and I'm telling you, that's comforting to know that he's not going to give up on it. That he's going to finish what he started in me, because I give up on myself. I sometimes, and there are times I look in the mirror and I think, God, what is it? How could you love me like you do? What is it about me? Because I fail again and again and again, and things that I say, okay, this morning I'm waking up and that will not be my day. This will not happen in my day. And bam, I'm not awake 5 minutes or finish with my prayer 5 minutes, and then there's something. But it's very important that we finish what we start, because number one, Again, we are followers of Christ, so therefore, He is our example. He finished everything He started. If you say you're going to do something, then you need to follow through and do it. The world is also watching us. There are people who are not saved, who, if they tell you they're going to do something or they're going to be somewhere, you can take it to the bank. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. In our churches, and I'm going to tell you, and this time I'm guilty. You commit. You're gung-ho in the beginning, and, and half of the year into it, you're lazy or just burned out or circumstances in your life, whatever the reason or excuse, halfway through the year, you see people start falling out of their commitments and not doing what they say they're going to do. Guilty. Guilty is charged.
Jesus had a parable, and it's called Consider the Cost.
Yes.
And He gave 2 parables. That's very important that if you want to do something,
consider the cost
consider
of it.
if you can get it done.
Yeah, because I think it's better not to commit to it and not do it. Yeah, I think it's better to not commit and not do it than to commit to it and then not finish it.
We do things for the wrong reasons sometimes.
And that's true. We commit for the wrong reasons. Well, that's what it's that in the beginning, what it was saying is that, you have people who give and things like that because of the recognition. They think about what it's going to bring to them, how it's going to make them look. I think people commit to positions in the church or to other things sometimes it is because of what it makes them appear. Sometimes, Jerry, I think it's just that they're, like the Corinthian church, they were so zealous, very gung-ho in the beginning, and then for whatever reason, we kind of fizzle out. The flame just kind of dwindles down to just a spark or, and therefore we find excuses not to finish what we started. And I think that it is a very poor example to the world.
Sure. They're looking for a reason.
Because you can find people who aren't saved, like I said, who say, I'm going to be here, I'm going to do this, and you can write it down on a calendar, and it's gonna happen because they said it. We tried to teach our boys, be a man of your word. What you say you're going to do, you follow through, and you do it. Because in life, your word carries a lot of weight. And if you become known as a person who cannot be counted on, then people aren't going to call you to help do anything. And they'll warn other people, I don't know if I would get that person to do that, because probably it's not going to happen.
And then if you start telling them about Jesus, they're really like, why should I listen to you? You have no credibility anyway.
And there lies the weight again of being a man or a woman of your word to the outside world. Paul was reminding them that they had made a commitment. And I think Paul was doing it in a way, he wasn't condescending to them, and he wasn't, like he said, commanding them or ridiculing them. He was reminding them, okay, this is what you've started. We need to, and earlier in chapter, or later in chapter 8, he was saying, I won't say bragged on you to the Macedonians and to all these other people about how committed you are. Don't let me down. I mean, that's basically, he did tell them that. He wasn't putting them on a guilt trip because he didn't want them to give out of guilt or pressure. But sometimes when we think that there is more at stake at it too, then we tend to follow through with it. Especially if we think that reputation, standing, we're reminded of those kinds of things. Sometimes that is the one thing that will begin to push us to start again or to really make it to the end of what it is that we've committed to. Paul wasn't trying to guilt them into it. He was just saying, I have told these people how dedicated you are and how dependable you are, and I really need you to follow through this. But he went ahead and sent people ahead of him so that the Corinthian church could be prepared, so that when he came with the other people, when Paul came, that it would be ready, and it wouldn't be that last minute pressure. People, now you're before these people, and the pressure was on them. He still wanted them to be giving from a willing and a cheerful heart, because God tells us in Corinthians that he, loves a cheerful giver. For if there be first a willing mind, this is going into verse 12, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. For I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened. I said earlier that we should not give more. God does not mean for us to burden ourselves out of asking us to give. Like I said, sometimes and I know in my own life there's been times where where God has dealt with me in giving something, and with David, and you're kind of like, it's not going to put me in the poorhouse, but it might take away some of the ease of getting a bill paid or buying your groceries that week. Paul told him it's a willing mind, and he did not mean that other men be eased and you be burdened. Okay, so this might be a little bit political here, but okay. Government wants a man to work hard and then trickle down to ease the burdens of others that just simply don't want to work or won't work. The Bible says a man that doesn't work shouldn't eat. I don't believe in what Paul was saying, that other men be eased and ye burdened. If I see a family struggling and I'm having trouble feeding my own kids, that I am to buy their groceries and not feed my own children. I ease their burden, but then mine became tremendous. And therefore, I think that the joy of that giving goes away. And then it's not with a cheerful heart that we give. It's with resentment that God has asked us to maybe give to someone else. And there's impulsive giving. Oh, mercy. I know that I have done impulsive giving. And you smiling about. And then been like, ooh, that was a little bit over what I might have had this week to hand out. So we have to be careful that we are listening to the Spirit and not to our flesh. Because if you do have the gift of giving and you do have that heart, number one, people can take advantage of it. And number two, sometimes we are then led by our flesh in that giving and not led by the Spirit. So you should be very careful that you are listening to the Spirit and not your flesh in that giving, because then you can ease the burden of others and then put the burden on your husband or your wife by the giving that you just did because it was impulsive as well. Sometimes there's giving that we should pray over it. God has laid something on our heart, but you got to make sure whether it's your heart or God or your flesh. Sometimes there's times you pray on it. And then sometimes it's like right then, instantaneous. God says, give that person $20. Well, $20 was just what they needed in gas to be able to get to work the next 2 days. $20 didn't break you. $20 didn't hurt you.
Say that for yourself.
Yeah. Well, it might have, but God somehow made, just like the cruise of oil, your gas hand just did not move the rest of that week. So, it comes down again to then listening to the Spirit and listening to your flesh, being impulsive and being guided by the Spirit. So I think that those are things that you also have to have discernment about, because you do not want to burden your own home. And I don't mean where you might have to sacrifice dinner and a movie on a Friday night versus whether or not there's food on your table for your children. There's a difference in that. So Paul is telling them, I'm not asking you to give to burden yourself, because in Corinth, even though it was a very wealthy city, within every city you still have poverty-stricken people. So I think that he may have been addressing maybe some of those that were a little more stingy with their giving than those, like you said, the poor tend to even give more than what those who have an overabundance to give. But by an equality that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there be equality. So what he's saying is, all right, you've got plenty right now. So you give in that abundance. Because there may come a time where the table is flipped and you are struggling. And then their blessings will be able to be poured back onto you. Those who sow abundantly will reap abundantly. Those who sow sparsely will reap sparsely. It's very important. And what is a lot to one person may be nothing to anyone else. The poor widow woman, she gave 2 mites. I had it written down. She has 2 mites. That was worth about 6 minutes of a daily wage. But Christ said that she gave more abundantly than anything else that was thrown into that treasury that day, because she gave all she had. Now, God doesn't tell us anything else about this little woman, but I can't help but believe that there was a blessing because he called her out and pointed her out to those around him. I can't help but believe that there was some major blessing for her down the road because he recognized her. We give because at some point in our life, it's going to come back to us. I'm not tooting mine and David's horn, but when we had our business, God blessed us to bless other people. There were things that we did we didn't tell anybody else about. When we lost all that, God put people that we had blessed, that he had blessed through us. Let me change that, had blessed through us. It came back to us. You can never outgive God, and you can never go wrong being obedient to the instruction of him. As it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. When we are blessed with much, it's not ours to hoard. There are things that we have to take care of in our home. Sometimes there are things in our home that need to be taken care of. You have a house. It has upkeep. There are things that need to be done, things that wear down, things that wear out. There are things that you need. But I believe that you should always be looking for the need of someone else. Because our blessings come to us to go through us. God does not heap that upon you for you to hoard it all for yourself. Take care of the needs that you have. Take care of the needs of those that you're responsible for. But I believe you should be looking for the needs of others around you so that you can take care of their needs. That's why it came to you. There's times that there have been extra things that came into our life, and then God would set someone in front of us who had a need. I had forgotten. Been so wrapped up in all the things since the struggles, and so wrapped up in that I have kind of forgotten how much I am called. Time, talent, treasury. Those are the 3 things that we should be giving out to others. Christ commands it. He was our example. He is the one that we should look to. And Paul was reminding the Corinthians of the commitment that they made, that they needed to follow through, because somewhere down the road, the tables might be flipped, and it would be them in want and need. And then they would need the abundance of those brothers and sisters that they themselves had helped. My time is up.
Hey, Valerie, I'd like to say, God's word says it's better to give than to receive.
It is.
And if you live long enough, you understand exactly what that means. As little children, you think, I don't want to give. I want to receive.
Yep.
And in 2012, like you said, we had a business ourselves
That's right.
Mother and father in the home.
That's right.
Depression, I had my arm and hand didn't work for almost 2 years. But I was all of a sudden on the receiving end.
That's right. That's hard sometimes to be the receiver.
Sometimes it's hard to accept. Try to go 4 to 5.
That's right.
We got on some assistance, and like I said, there was people that give you that $20 here, and give you that $20 there,
because it was laid on their hearts. That's right.
And it may not be. I will say, y'all don't know her like I do, but she's one of the most giving people I know. And I'm just pinning that rose on you because there's times I'm like, what are you doing? But I know she's done it.
I'd be like, just trust God.
Because I remember those days.
Yeah.
There was times that we'd write a check out, put it off plate, and I'd be like, oh, look at me. God can take that right.
Yes, He can.
It ain't nothing about us. And if God's ever broke you down where you have to receive, you get a humble.
And He will do that. If you give pridefully or you give grudgingly, and God has blessed you tremendously, and you do not use those funds the way that, like Dave Ramsey will tell you, nothing we have is ours. It all belongs to God. That money, that belongs to God. We are stewards to do with those funds that God has supplied us with as He appoints us to do it. But be honest with you, how many of you, don't raise your hand, I'm going to raise that, but pray over your money before you do with it. Let's be honest about that. We need to make sure that the blessings that come to us, we send them back out to bless others, to show the love of Christ, His goodness, His grace. He is our supplier. He is the source. Everything else that we have that brings it to us is just a resource.
It is also an act of faith, too.
It is.
You know what? God's going to meet my needs.
That's right. That's right. So when He tells you, like I said, sometimes He will ask you to give, and you know that is tight. But if it's coming from Him, and it's the Spirit, it's not the impulsive of our flesh, it is the Spirit of the Lord guiding us to do that, He will take care of whatever needs we have. It's just the obedience. Obedience is better than sacrifice. So it's the obedience to Him that He blesses. There are people standing out in the hall, so I'd like to dismiss. Amanda, will you dismiss us?